Hello, I'm Cherie Spellman, and I'm here with Katie Trillos, and we are here to talk about the differences between Brainspotting and EMDR. And just to even start us off, we're going to talk a little bit about just basic approach differences between the two models, because I'm sure some people, when Googling or searching or hearing about things, they're like, how are they different? Why would I choose one over the other? What kind of therapist to look for, things like that. So
yeah, well, I think starting with the approach, it kind of helps us, guide us through the differences between Brainspotting and EMDR. So the way that EMDR approaches maybe trauma or a presenting symptom that you may have is that EMDR theorizes that it's all based from a poorly stored memory. Okay, and because this memory has been poorly stored in our brains, we are experiencing some adverse symptoms today. So I like to think of it. An example would be, let's say you are at your job and you like your job and you're good at your job and you're successful, and then your boss comes to you and asks you to present in front of your team. And all of a sudden, you are experiencing anxiety. You are experiencing fear of failure, or whatever it might be. It's problematic, and it's affecting your daily life.
yeah, you're shaking.
Yeah, shaking in your boots. Yeah. And you don't know why, because you're really competent at what you do.
Yeah.
So you might go to an EMDR therapist, and through maybe some exercises or through talking, maybe you arrive at the first memory where you felt like that before, and it's when you are 5 years old and you're in kindergarten and you had to share about your favorite animal, and everyone ended up laughing and you felt really embarrassed. And so EMDR would theorize that when that happened, the way that you remembered it was poorly stored in your brain. And so every time you have to get up in front of a crowd, now you are racked with anxiety and fear and embarrassment. And so, and then when we talk about brainspotting kind of comes from this approach of, well, we might not know if it really was the memory of when you were 5.
There's a phrase we use in Brainspotting is that you don't have to know what it is to know that it is.
Yeah.
So we don't necessarily assume that it's from a past experience or a certain past memory. We really go in just noticing what's bothering you.
Yeah.
Or what you're wanting to work on. Yeah.
I would say too, well, what if, I might ask the question of well, what if this happened before we had memories? Or what if we don't necessarily remember the first time that we were anxious? Or maybe it doesn't even come from a prior performance anxiety memory. And so Brainspotting is kind of based on that. It could be anything.
Yeah, and I think that's one big difference with Brainspotting in terms of its even inclusivity, its neuro-experiential piece, just that it invites anything in the room that we might not even be aware of. And, whether that's intergenerational trauma, birth trauma, pre-verbal trauma. So a lot of times people are like, I have this feeling, but I have no idea where it comes from. I have no memory of, it's just, I have no words for it. And sometimes we don't assume what it's from, but a lot of times that's pre-verbal, and we're not going to have necessarily a memory. It's just a felt sense.
Yeah.
So Brainspotting kind of opens that door, or even the spiritual component to come in to play as well.
Yeah. And I think, and knowing kind of the approaches between EMDR and Brainspotting, it kind of guides us into other things as well. So when I think of EMDR, if I wanted to get started with EMDR, since EMDR is based on kind of what happened to you in the past is what's affecting you in the present, we're going to do a pretty detailed history taking. So EMDR has a standard protocol that it follows. And so we're going to start kind of at the beginning, and we're going to take kind of a detailed intake. Now, I do want to note that EMDR is different from traditional talk therapies, and you don't necessarily have to divulge all this, traumatic information. However, you are asked to map out. So a therapist might even use a visual, and you map out things from a young age to where you are today. And then you go into like a preparation phase. So after you do an history taking phase, and you go into preparing for the trauma processing part of EMDR. And so that is where your therapist will kind of take you through certain activities or certain exercises to kind of help you to contain or feel safe before we enter into like a desensitization or a trauma processing phase. So this could take up to 2 to 5, 6 sessions before you actually start to really work on these problematic memories. Brainspotting is different.
Yeah, brainspotting, kind of the idea behind it is that they're coming in, and usually they're coming in because the house is on fire. And we're not going to sit there and be like, okay, I know the house is on fire, but tell me like the past stuff. And we just kind of go straight in to helping the client resource and just start working on what they're there to work on, which is a bit different because one question that I get from clients sometimes in consultations is, oh, am I going to have to go through and tell you everything? Or am I going to have to do that intake process? And the answer is no. Like, we, in Brainspotting, we kind of look at it as we work things that are relevant will come up as needed. So there's not necessarily a reason to identify all the relevant past points up front. So that,
I just like the idea that you can get started in the first session. And then...
Doesn't mean in Brainspotting that you will.
Right.
Yes. Sometimes there's, needing to build that relationship and trust, and you might not do Brainspotting in the first session, depending on the client. So
and like Brainspotting is very much it's very individualized to each client, and while EMDR can also be individualized to each client, and the processing or the phase 1 and phase 2, the history taking and the preparation phase, is going to depend whether what you're coming in with. Brainspotting is really great because it really can be customized to each client. EMDR follows a standard protocol, and so there's not as much creativity or openness that Brainspotting offers. A key difference too is the role of the therapist. So in EMDR, because we do kind of like an extensive history taking, and because we do the preparation, and then there's a standard protocol for processing, it is more therapist-led. Now, comparatively in talk therapy, EMDR is, the therapist isn't as involved maybe in talk therapy. In talk therapy, your therapist may offer you alternative perspectives. They may offer you some tips or some advice. They may validate you on some certain things or challenge you. EMDR really kind of takes that out of that process and really focuses on the protocol. And then, but a key difference between EMDR and Brainspotting is that Brainspotting is client-led. And that we go where you need to go. While EMDR therapists are encouraged to be present with the client and mindful of the reactions and the processing that they're doing in session, I would say one of the foundational core principles of Brainspotting is this attunement that the therapist has with the client. And that is so healing in itself.
Absolutely. And I would think too, for EMDR, that having that structure and that protocol for some people can be really helpful in knowing, okay, this is the process. This is what I go through. This is what we're going to work on. And I think for some people that is going to be helpful because it kind of soothes that type A brain a little bit. Yeah, it's like, okay, I can get behind that. And it's like, okay, we can agree to that. Where brain spotting would maybe even challenge that part a little bit.
Yeah.
Which I look at it as a positive thing because we're getting people to come into more uncertainty and learning how to follow themselves. But I can also see EMDR as being attractive for that reason.
Yes, it is nice.
Yes.
Two, also something is that if you have clients, you know, if you feel like you have to do everything right, and in EMDR, there kind of is a right way to do it. And in brain spotting, there's really not a right way to do it.
And that comes up in my brain spotting sessions a lot, but I'm like, that's part of the process. Like, that's part of the healing process. And we'll always say, just notice that.
Yes.
Just notice that you want to do this right now.
Yeah.
Like, and what's that feel like in your body?
We can spot that.
Yes. Let's work through that. And sometimes that is, like, sometimes that is something that you work on in the process of brain spotting.
Yeah.
So with that, like, just that beginning part, getting started with therapy in those models.
Yeah. And so we've kind of talked about, you know, we'll do the history taking, and then we'll do the preparation phase. So I think one of the things to note is kind of like what might it look, what might a typical brain spotting session and a typical EMDR session, like how would they look? And so when I talk about a typical EMDR session, I'm going to talk about a session that you would have after you've gotten started. So this is after you've kind of mapped out where you want to go, mapped out what you want to work on, mapped out, you know, listed out those target memories, after you've done the sufficient amount of preparing. Then we go into phase 3, which is this desensitization phase. Or you go into an assessment phase and then you go into desensitization. And so your therapist will ask you to start with the target memory. And then there's a series of other things that they will do. But again, all very standard and all very mapped out. So after you kind of go through those, after you kind of go through that outline of the things that you need to do, the therapist will bring in bilateral stimulation. Okay? And normally as an EMDR client, you will have already experienced some sort of bilateral stimulation in the preparation phase. But bilateral stimulation is used as a way to help you process, really in this part, in the desensitization phase.
So tell me more of like bilateral stimulation, like what would I expect?
Yeah,
what
like,
would
what is it?
Yeah.
So your therapist can use a variety of tools. So bilateral stimulation can be visual, it can be audio, or it can be tactile. And so your therapist will either take 2 fingers and kind of go back and forth across your visual field. They may provide you with headphones and you will hear tones that kind of oscillate between each of your ears. Or we have some things called tappers, and it's just a device that kind of vibrates between each hand. And it goes pretty quickly. And I think it's kind of helpful to think of it as like REM sleep. So when we are sleeping and when our brain is kind of like integrating the information that we've received that day, if you've ever watched someone who's asleep, like a child or a partner, you may notice that their eyes kind of go back and forth. And that's kind of like a theory behind how EMDR kind of helps to process those traumatic memories, is that it's helping you integrate and reprocess that trauma so that you can move through your daily life with more ease. One thing to also note in this phase is that you are trying to get those really distressing feelings that might come up when you're talking about this target memory. You're trying to get it down to a 0. So you want so there's really no negative felt sense. That can be kind of difficult for some people who've either experienced an injustice or something just really traumatic, or maybe who are driven by results and wanting to make sure that they do things right and get it down to a 0.
I can imagine that some things just aren't going to just get down to a 0.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so the goal in either in that session, and this can last over several sessions, is to eventually get that target memory or even a target feeling kind of down to a level of no disturbance. And then in Brainspotting, it's a little different.
It is a little different. Yeah, the goal's not to get down to 0.
Yes.
I'll just say that. Though that might happen.
Yes.
But then we go into expansion. Yeah, sorry. But I'll talk a little bit about a typical Brainspotting session for when you come in. And, I would say, even in the initial session, right? Like the client's coming in because they're wanting to work on something. So whether it's the first session or follow-up sessions, we usually, the first thing we do is check in on what's present for you, because there's a phrase in Brainspotting that we use that where you look affects how you feel, and that if you feel it, we can brain spot it. So we're just looking for what you can connect with that day. Yeah. And that might be different. So it's not just even, usually we'll follow up on what we've worked on previously, but we don't assume that that's what we're going to work on. And because we also assume that when you leave us, that it's not necessarily going to be in the same place, that it'll continue to move and process throughout the time that we don't spend together. So it's really a check-in of what's present for you now. What does your system feel like connecting to or able to connect to? That's important.
Yeah, that able piece.
Yeah, so we will find that, kind of talk about that, build some connection to that. And sometimes, clients come in, it's like present, and you're like, okay, well, there it is. Yeah, you just jump right into the Brainspotting process. And sometimes it's like, a little bit more unsure, and you're talking a little bit more to really connect and really narrow down what you're really wanting to work on in that frame. And I look at Brainspotting as having a few core components to it. Is one, the eye position, which a lot of times we will use a pointer for. And as this is just to hold the eye position. And so, right, you're coming in with your topic of choice, and we'll usually ask, how much present that is from 0 to 10. And then we'll ask, where do you feel that in your body? And then we will find an eye position somewhere in your visual field that connects to that felt sense in your body. And sometimes it's hard to feel things in our body, so that's not a problem. It's, any even connection in the mind of where you feel like you can think about it easier, remember it easier. So anything like that. And then we have the eye position. Now, also while you're processing, you may also use bilateral stimulation like in EMDR. Brainspotting typically diverts to just audio bilateral stimulation with music, and they specifically use what they call bilateral music, which is slightly different than regular bilateral music, and we won't go into the details about that, but use bilateral. So you might have headphones on, and then you have your eye position, and one of the other core components is focus mindfulness. So with the eye position, that kind of acts, I think of it as like a doorway into the area of the brain that emotion or experience is housed, that you want to enter into. And the focus mindfulness process helps you drop into the midbrain where that's housed and stay there. And that process, that focus mindfulness, helps the brain to quickly move through it in a I say very fast. I call it light speed. It's like you're going through it and you might have like all kinds of different thoughts, memories, physical sensations kind of coming through. And we invite people to just notice it and keep track of it.
Yes.
So the brain can do what it needs to do to heal. And that's one of the premises too of Brainspotting, is that we are self-healing human beings. And that we have the capability to heal ourselves. So we are giving that space with the eye position and the focus mindfulness. And one of the other key components to Brainspotting that we believe is the therapist's attunement to the client. And that is something very much emphasized in Brainspotting. So your therapist should be highly attuned to the relationship with you and what you need in those moments, and working with you to find what you need to give you that space, and very attuned to what's happening in your system neurologically. So we are looking out for, rapid blinking, twitches in the body, swallows, change of heart rate, things like that, that help us know that things are moving, shifting, changing, all of those fun things to see when clients are processing.
Yes, so fun.
It's like, oh, something's happening.
Yes. Oh, they just swallowed.
Yeah.
Oh, they just blinked.
Yeah. Everybody's like, well, why is that a big deal? It's like, yeah, that's cool. So that, and then we check in, and then we kind of bring you back into your neocortex, help you kind of integrate what happened in that focus mindfulness piece. And then we just usually invite you to kind of just be mindful and keep track of what comes up in the meantime. And that's typically a Brainspotting session.
Something I think that's really important to note too is that like in an EMDR session, you will have that kind of bilateral stimulation going on, and then your therapist will come in after a certain amount of passes and will ask you like, what did you notice? And then encourage you to go with that or to notice that. And in Brainspotting, there's really not that interruption. So you are kind of allowed to process for as long as you need to process, because sometimes what happens is that maybe in EMDR you'll have a client who is processing a really traumatic memory, and then when we go in and check in with, oh, how are you doing, we're kind of bringing you out of that deeper brain healing. That can happen, and it also can be a nice break. So but yeah, that's something I really appreciate about Brainspotting.
Yeah, I would say from feedback that I've gotten from clients that have tried both, and they like Brainspotting because they feel like they can go deeper and just have a more healing experience because they're not getting interrupted. But some people want to be checked in on.
Yes. Yeah.
And so like as a potential client for it, it's really important for you to communicate with your therapist, and your therapist would hopefully be asking you, like, do you need me to check in more or speak more?
Yes.
Otherwise, the therapist, if we see the blinks and the swallows and the twitching and knowing that something's happening for you, we want to get out of the way. We want you to be able to get the most healing out of that. So we don't want to jump in and check in on what's going on. And so that's where that attunement and feedback come in that relationship.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, it's so important. And I love that aspect of Brainspotting where as a therapist, we ask the client, what can we do to help you? And so it's like we're giving that power and that ability to heal back to you, back to the client. And we get to participate in that.
What about any misconceptions you feel like people have when they come in for EMDR?
I think that people may expect for it to go quickly, and sometimes it doesn't. You may kind of think that you may have heard a lot about EMDR. EMDR is very kind of like a buzzword these days. I feel like a lot of people have heard about EMDR. And so you may kind of come in with some expectations, and that can be something that you kind of have to work through, that this work does take a while. I do notice that, in EMDR sessions, you're able to maybe work through some things a little quicker than in talk therapy. It just kind of depends. But there's still a lot of work that has to be done.
Yeah, and I would say that's one difference between both Brainspotting EMDR and regular talk therapy. And this isn't necessarily comparing these to talk therapy, which we can do another time, but that in general, EMDR and Brainspotting goes faster than talk therapy.
Yes.
So even though it's slow, most people's experience when working on anxiety, trauma, distressing feelings, that it takes them a lot longer to notice differences in talk therapy than in Brainspotting or EMDR.
Yeah.
And Brainspotting has a phrase we like to use is fast is slow and slow is fast. So giving yourself permission to go slow because the healing process is slow.
Yeah.
Yes. And if we try to push it, right? That's when we injure ourselves, I think, from a physical standpoint.
Yeah. But also from a mental standpoint as well.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. So that's something to keep in mind. I'm trying to think of Brainspotting. Like, I think it's interesting because in Brainspotting, I think of it as it's a very fast process, and that it's still it's still slow. Right? It's not a one and done thing. There's multiple layers. There's layers in the brain, and that you've got to work through them and at different angles. And everybody's experience is going to be different.
Yes.
And
so versatile.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And well, I would say a big misconception for Brainspotting is that it is not EMDR. It was developed out of EMDR by David Grand, who did EMDR and EMDR, I think it was flow or natural flow. Natural flow EMDR. And so, but it is not EMDR. And this is just a pointer that holds an eye position. People often wonder, like, what are you holding? Like, it is like a teacher pointer. Okay. And then you might have different objects or things on top for you to look at. And I'm trying to think of...
that Brainspotting isn't just for trauma.
Yes, that's right. I think, and I don't know if EMDR
can be utilized for just about anything, and they're doing a lot of research on that as well. It's kind of like a growing part, because if you think about the approach of EMDR, like the theory behind it is that any problematic symptom that you're experiencing, anything that's problematic that you're experiencing now, is related to a poorly or maladaptively stored memory. So it can be, if you're experiencing anxiety, then we can work on that with EMDR. And yet Brainspotting has so many different, has even additional
right, because
applications.
that neuroexperiential kind of really expands it into the possibilities of what you can work on with Brainspotting in the room. And yes, I think a big misconception when people hear Brainspotting is that it's a trauma model.
Yes.
But I would say it's actually not taught as a trauma model. It's taught as a model that can be very helpful with trauma.
Yeah.
And it's really taught to be able to help you work on anything that you come in with. Some of my favorite sessions that I like to do is acting coaching with Brainspotting, chronic pain. I've seen it so helpful with chronic pain. Creativity, expansion work for anything that you want to feel more of.
Yeah.
Right, helping you gain more access. Athletes, performance blocks. Really helping you get into the deep brain, and creating new neural connections and emotions in that. And I know some therapists that even integrate Brainspotting in couples work. I've done that a few times because it's so attachment based as well in that attunement. So
yeah, I would say that EMDR is kind of like a standalone modality. You go to an EMDR therapist, you may kind of switch off with some talk therapy here and there, but with Brainspotting can really be used alongside anything else. And I think that's so cool.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very integrative. I just thought of another misconception for Brainspotting that people are like, because when we tell you, you know, just to mindfully process, and then people are like, am I allowed to talk? And like, yes, you're allowed to do that. If you feel a need to talk, it's just about noticing what you need in those moments. And it doesn't mean that you're coming in and we're going to be silent the whole time while you focus.
Yes.
Like, mindfully process. Like, we will talk. And we can talk. Yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think, anything else, Katie?
Yeah,
to note?
The only thing I would, just from personal experience, so I'm trained in EMDR and I'm also trained in Brainspotting. And when some of the experiences that I've had is that even after sufficient history taking and preparation, I've still seen EMDR sometimes be a little too overwhelming for clients. While I know the same thing can happen in Brainspotting, I haven't noticed that as much. Is that Brainspotting is really based on this kind of resource model, and that we are coming in from this basis, from like a more grounded foundation, and there's a lot more creativity and a lot more ways that we can kind of adjust Brainspotting to fit the needs of the client. And while you can do the same thing with EMDR, it's more standardized, so sometimes it's a little more difficult to do that.
Yeah, and I'm glad you said that, because that's sometimes feedback that I get from clients that are coming to me for Brainspotting, and they've tried EMDR. Now, I'm not trained in EMDR, so this isn't from firsthand experience. I just do Brainspotting. But typically what I've heard is that Brainspotting is more gentle, and Brainspotting does teach that in and of itself, it's a resource for a client and helps clients move from dysregulation to regulation in the nervous system, and taking that piece away of having to talk about a traumatic experience. Like, people are welcome to, you know, if they just want to share a word or just how they're feeling versus talking about, they're very welcome. We don't have to know what it is as a therapist. Yeah. So, well, thank you, Katie.
You're welcome.
Yeah. If feel free to shoot us any questions that you have in the comments, and we'd be happy to answer them. I know we didn't get to everything today, but hopefully that gives you an idea of, you know, what to expect in Brainspotting versus EMDR. As you know, I just do Brainspotting, so I'm a little biased on my personal preference. And maybe, I don't know, Katie, do you have a preference?
Well, if you couldn't tell from my conversation, I will say, as someone who's trained in EMDR and then trained in Brainspotting, I tend to use Brainspotting a little more often.
That's right.
Just because of the things that we've mentioned as far as differences go. But they're both great modalities. They both have evidence, scientific case studies that have shown the effectiveness of them.
Now I will say, speaking to that, there are more studies for EMDR because it's been around much longer. So Brainspotting is working towards getting more of that research. So I know that's a criticism of Brainspotting sometimes, but yes, they are both good models to choose from.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you for watching.